Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Today we are talking about Chile, notably the Atacama Desert, one of those places where people have told me for decades, you have to go there. We have author Mark Johansen on the podcast today. Mark recently wrote Mars on Earth, a travel memoir about the Atacama, but also about Chile and what it's like to be a stranger in the country you live in. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited to chat. I loved your book. It's one of those books I binged over a weekend when it was minus 30 Celsius outside. But before we talk about the Atacama, I think what's really interesting is your story and how you've interweaved that into the book. And maybe can you start by just sharing how you end up living in Chile in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question and kind of a long answer, but it actually goes back to New Zealand of all places. When I was in my mid-20s, I did a working holiday visa to New Zealand, and I ended up in a hotel in a town of about 400 people called Franz Josef, which is next to these glaciers that go down through the temperate rainforest into the Tasman Sea. And a lot of Chileans were working there. It was, there's maybe at least 7 or 8 Chileans there, and I ended up dating one of them. And then we continued along our working holiday visa in New Zealand. We backpacked around Southeast Asia and then India over another 6 months. And then we ended up moving to Australia. And long story short, a little over a decade ago, ended up moving to his country, Chile, where I've made myself home for the past 10 years.
What I think is really interesting about your book is kind of an outsider's take at a country. I was trying to think there's often travel logs where people talk about like just venturing through a country. Um, but your book's kind of like someone who's lived there and learned what they know and what they don't know. Um, and like kind of this outsider take. And for you, like what are the challenges of being an outsider in a country where you're gonna live there the rest of your life?
Well, I never say rest of my life. Who knows? We'll see. But for the time being, certainly, yeah. It's a good question. I think, the journey of this book as well is sort of trying to be a more informed outsider. So the book starts in this big social uprising that really made me realize that I didn't quite understand the country I was living in the way that I wanted to. And that set me off on this journey of trying to understand it better. But to your point, I do think that being an outsider helps you pinpoint things that maybe local people don't even see or don't realize are unique about the place that they live in. So, for example, just as a journalist, I've had to ask people in Chile sometimes something like, "What's it like to parent in Chile? How is it different from parenting in other countries?" And the things that they point to are just things that happen all over the world. But I know as an outsider, I can point to 3 or 4 things that they're doing that are so Chilean that wouldn't happen anywhere else in the world. So I think that being an outsider gives you a certain perspective on how things work one way and how they differ from how they might work in another place. I certainly would hope, though, that it comes from the perspective of an informed outsider, somebody who's not just parachuting into the place without any concept or understanding. I mean, what I really tried to do with this book is highlight the things that I notice about this country that make it unique, the idiosyncrasies of this country. And yeah, I hope that came through.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And one thing that also I really loved is just the history of Chile. And I wonder if you can share a little bit more on just Chile's history because it's so interesting. And I think hopefully most people know about the Allende coup in the 70s. They probably know that there's a resource boom, or there has been for a while, but there's so much more that you talk about. Even just the protests of 2020. I'd already forgotten that in the chaos of all the everything else
Hmm.
going on, but can you maybe just give a primer for, you know, how Chile's developed and why it's a little bit different from its neighbors?
Sure. Yeah. So I think to this day there's one major event that reverberates throughout the history and as the subject of movies and TV shows, every year, and that is the coup that you just mentioned, the coup of Augusto Pinochet in 1973. So before that, just to back up a bit, in the early 1970s, Chile elected one of Latin America's first socialist presidents. It was a democratic election, but the U.S., of course, at that moment was in the midst of the Cold War, saw socialism as a threat, and so the CIA teamed up with the military in Chile to overthrow its democratically elected socialist government, which led to nearly 2 decades worth of military dictatorship, which didn't end until 1990. So my partner, Felipe, was, he was born into a dictatorship. And that's why it just hangs over society right up to this day. And as we were talking about before, the social uprising of 2019 that took place was really the first time that the government sent the military back out onto the streets to patrol Santiago, where I live, the capital, since the end of the dictatorship. So it was a really shocking moment for people in this country, especially older generations, to see, for the first time in decades, military out on the streets. People were, sort of combating, going up against the military, and it was a pretty shocking moment. And so through this book, I tried to look at, the different historical moments that led up to what makes Chile so unique and so different. I think it's just its historic isolation as well. You're isolated through a dictatorship, but also Chile just geographically is so isolated. You have the Andes to the east, you have the Pacific Ocean to the west, you have the Atacama up north, and the fjords of Patagonia down south. So I mean, it has natural borders on every side. And I think that that's contributed to what makes Chile quite different from its Latin American neighbors.
And then the protests that happened, you mentioned, what was the cause of these protests? Because they were, really widespread.
Yeah, so the protest in 2019 came about as a way of protesting social inequality. If you look at the OECD countries, Chile is one of the most unequal countries in terms of the disparities between rich and poor. And it's something that was sort of slowly building over time, but then really exploded on the 18th of October in 2019. And by the end of that night, 52 metro stations are on fire. A lot of the city's infrastructure was just in shambles. It started out as a very sort of violent protest, but then segued into something that the vast majority of Chileans were supporting, to the point where a week later, more than 1 million people were out on the streets of Santiago marching. This is a city of 7 million people, so 1 in 7 people were out on the streets in the center of Santiago marching, in this fight to sort of make Chile a more just and equal society. You'll have to read the book to see how that played out. There's a lot of ups and downs that have happened since then, but that was sort of the origins of the big uprising here.
And then kind of looking at, public protests. This is something I used to live in Argentina. I live right by Congreso. Every day there was like every day there was big protests. Traveling in Europe, there's always big protests. But in English speaking countries, we don't protest. Is this a country where there's, regular protests? So getting 1 million people out it's still big, but you know, people are used to protesting for things they feel strongly about, or is this more like the English speaking country where getting people to protest is really like, anybody to protest is really big?
Yeah. So Chile is a country that has historically, over the past decades, I think, starting from especially the dictatorship and protesting to make an end to the dictatorship, has always been a country of people who will go out onto the streets to protest, whether it's for education reform or better, more just, more dignified retirements. There's been a swing of a group of different things over the years that people have gone out into the streets to march for. But to have, I think they counted 1.2 million people on the streets of Santiago on one day was really a massive historic event. I mean, that had no other time in history had there been that many people out on the streets. So putting it into perspective, it was really a big deal. It wasn't just like all the other protests that happened, which, as you mentioned, like any Latin American country, there are certainly lots of protests for different things here and there, but this was certainly different.
And so all this kind of led into this journey. You went up to the Atacama. Uh, a lot of people know the Atacama as a name. They might know a little bit more, but can you maybe just describe it? For a person who just knows the name or just knows that it's a desert.
Sure. So the Atacama is the world's driest non-polar desert. I use that qualifier non-polar just because the McMurdo dry valleys of Antarctica are perhaps a little bit drier, according to some scientists. But for all intents and purposes, the Atacama Desert is the driest place on Earth where humans are actually living. And there are quite a few people who live in the Atacama. More than 1 million people, in fact, live in the Atacama Desert, mostly in a string of large cities along the coast. And the reason that you have that many people up there is because it's a really mineral rich part of the world. It's got massive copper deposits. You also find silver, gold, and historically, the main mineral was nitrates. And currently, these days, the main mineral is lithium. Which is what is needed for lithium ion batteries that are fueling this transition from gas powered vehicles to electric ones. And Chile has the largest known lithium reserves in the world. So it's something that if you hear about perhaps on the news, it's oftentimes for its mineral riches and sort of what it can offer the rest of the world. I wanted to sort of pull the curtain behind that and look at what it is for the people who live there, what it means for the mostly indigenous groups who live along the higher altitude parts of the desert, and just what makes it geographically such a unique part of our planet.
And I think that's what's really interesting is there's the history, there's just like the knowledge and like learning about things you don't know combined with this travel memoir of yours. For you specifically, why the Atacama? Why not go into the Andes, go south into the fjords? Like there's so much variety. What drew you personally to the desert?
Yeah, so this story was always meant for me to be a way of understanding the country better, and I thought what better place to start than the part of Chile that most Chileans don't even understand. I mean, in Santiago, the capital, or I should say this first, between Santiago and Valparaiso and Viña del Mar, there's this three cities, about two-thirds of all Chileans live between these three cities, which are an hour and a half apart from each other. So, when anyone from this middle part of Chile thinks about, their country, they're often always looking to the south. If they have a second home, if they're going on vacations, if they're sort of dreaming about the wonders of Chile, it's always from the center looking down. And I wanted to look north up to the Atacama, which covers, the northern third of Chile, because it's what drives the mineral rich economy here. This is where all the money, all the wealth of this country is coming from the north. But if you ask people in the capital, they often just think of it as this wasteland, this place of broken dreams and scummy mining towns and prostitutes and drugs coming in from the north. And I wanted to sort of dispel some of those myths and see the truth behind them. And I don't know, it just was this part of the country that it always felt like a mystery, and that I really wanted to try and scratch beneath the surface and understand a bit better.
Through the book, we're introduced to a lot of kind of unique characters and kind of my takeaway is it takes someone a bit special to want to live in these areas. Granted, if it's a high paying job, obviously people go there to work, but lots of people are living regular lives in these inhospitable places. What do you think draws people to these harsh environments?
I think it's a combination of different things. Some people are drawn for opportunities, work opportunities, obviously in the mines. But to your point about who's drawn to live in a place like that, I do find that deserts all over the world tend to attract kind of outcasts and outsiders, and I think it has to do with how vast the sky is in a desert. You have just this wide open sky, a gaping sky above you. So you can really feel this palpable connection between Earth and whatever else there is out there. And then, at nighttime, the stars are just brighter stars than you will see anywhere else on the Earth. So it just opens you up to big thinking and daydreaming and creative pursuits. A lot of creatives, I think, certainly in the southern part of the Atacama. I was in the Elqui Valley, which is a place known for creative types, and was the epicenter of lots of new age philosophies, and cults have been attracted there over the years. And I don't think it's that dissimilar to, if you look at an American example, Roswell, New Mexico, where some of the most famous UFO sightings come from, or Sedona, Arizona, which is, epicenter of New Age philosophies. A lot of these things tend to happen in desert environments. Um, and yeah, I think that this trip kind of proved to me why that is, why these places attract those people.
much of the book had me on my phone looking in Google Maps, trying to see, trying to find, the spelling's never the exact same, but trying to find the places. And like it really blew me away, just like some of these places you went to, and just like this stark beauty. There was one place, Tres Cruces National Park. I'm sure I'm saying it wrong. Uh, which just for me, like it looks stunning. But for you, what makes that part special? Um, compared to maybe the other parts of the Atacama.
Sure. Yeah. Look, at least in the book, it's the first time I go up onto the Altiplano. And for listeners who might not be aware, the Altiplano is the second largest high plateau on Earth after Tibet. So it's this really spectacular high place where you have 30% less oxygen than you would down at the surface level. Um, and it's just full of other superlatives too. So particularly in that park, Tres Cruces, you're right next to the world's highest altitude volcano, which is Ojos del Salado. And on top of that volcano is the world's highest crater lake, or its highest body of water, I should say, which is the crater lake of that volcano. So it's just this really superlative rich part of our planet. And for people who like to be in kind of extreme environments. I mean, there's extreme ultraviolet radiation. There are some extreme winds up on the Altiplano that feel like, you go for a hike and you feel like you're walking through a hurricane. So it's an uncomfortable place. But what I write about a lot in the book is that we shouldn't be so scared of uncomfortable places because they're quite often the kind of places that will make you feel really deep emotions. And um, it's almost like doing drugs without doing drugs when you go to these places, just because they take you out of your everyday environment and thrust you into a different way of feeling Earth, a different way of feeling like you're living on this planet because you can't breathe as you do down below. You can't walk like you do down below because the winds are so strong. You have to navigate the sunshine all day because it's so strong. And those all may sound like kind of negatives, but I don't mean them to be. I just mean that they make you live in a different way than you're used to, and that's quite interesting sometimes.
It's funny as you're talking about that, I was thinking too, going up in the Canadian Rockies in winter and going on these glacier ski tours
Hmm.
where you don't see any green, you just see white. You have these incredible katabatic winds that'll come off, and it's kind of the same thing. It's really hard in the moment. It feels uncomfortable if you're
Hmm.
freezing. You get sunburnt all over your lips, crack, but
Exactly.
there's
Yeah.
something just being in the elements, being in a place so extreme that you know you just have these incredible memories, and you really feel the draw of Earth. Sometimes I think just
Absolutely.
you're
Yeah.
in a different place from the comfort of a suburban home or a condo.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's exactly how I felt when I was up on the Altiplano, which is one of the most extreme parts of the Atacama.
Now, most people who go to the Atacama go to San Pedro de Atacama. Full disclosure, I'm going to go to San Pedro in like 3 weeks. I wish I'd read this book like 9 months ago when we were planning all this. 'Cause it's like, oh, I totally would have changed what we're doing. But for people who are going to go to the Atacama, and maybe they don't just want to see kind of the central tourist town, are there other places people should consider saying, "Oh, this was a beautiful part that, is worthy of, a visit as well?"
Yeah, definitely. And first, I'll say San Pedro is wonderful. Nothing against San Pedro. It's just my only beef with San Pedro is it's the only place that most people will ever see in the Atacama Desert. It's where almost every single international visitor who goes there will go to San Pedro, and for good reason. It's surrounded by wonderful salt flats and lagoons and volcanoes, so it's definitely worth the visit. But if you feel like you want to get a bit more off the beaten path, there's two other places that I would recommend. And one of those is Arica in the far north. So, Arica is the world's driest city, and it's also home to the world's oldest mummies, the Chinchorro mummies. And the Chinchorro are over 2,000 years older than the mummies in Egypt, and yet most people have never heard of them. So you can go to the city and you can actually step on these glass planks and sort of see the mummies beneath you in situ where they were discovered. And then you can go to the museum as well and see all the mummies that are on display in the museum. And then from Arica, you can travel about 2 hours towards the Bolivian border, and you find this other park called Lauca National Park, and it's just has everything that San Pedro has in terms of volcanoes and salt flats and lagoons, with just a fraction of the people there. And I remember, for example, going to one of these hot springs. You know, it's not a kind of hot spring where you go and you pay some money and there's a bunch of people and you're sitting there, la la la. It was just this wild hot spring in the middle of nowhere with alpacas, wandering off in the distance, and there was a lone flamingo sort of tiptoeing through the hot waters. So you can really just get off the beaten path and explore some incredible high altitude again. Parts of the Atacama that are as accessible because they're off of a highway that goes all the way to La Paz from Arica, La Paz in Bolivia, but just see so many fewer people. The other place that I would recommend is the Elqui Valley, which is not technically in the Atacama Desert, it's just beneath it. And the Elqui Valley is the epicenter of Chile's pisco industry. So you can go, to some pisco distilleries by day, try some pisco sours, the national drink. And then at night, it's also the epicenter of Chile's astronomy industry. So the Atacama Desert has 2/3 of the world's astronomy, or ground-based astronomy facilities, and a lot of them are based in and around the Elqui Valley. So you can go on certain tours on certain weekends to see the ones that all the scientists are working in, and then you can go at night to some of the more touristic ones and look at the night sky and search the Milky Way. You can go one night and do it from a scientific perspective, and then go another night to learn about how the local indigenous communities see the night sky. Which is to say, to look at the night sky for its dark spots instead of its light spots, which most of us have probably never done before. So I would say both of those places are just fascinating and sort of untapped in the foreign market.
What's interesting is just read about all the different resource towns and whether dying, dead, booming.
Hmm.
Um, what's the impact, from your point of view going through the Atacama, what's the impact of resources in the Atacama? Has it brought health and wealth to the people? Or, have maybe they not shared equally? What did you find?
Yeah, it's a tricky and complex history. I mean, the Atacama itself was really first populated because of nitrate. Nitrate was used for fertilizers over 100 years ago. It was used for gunpowder. It helped fuel World War I. And until a synthetic nitrate was developed, I believe in the 1930s, um, much of the desert was populated by these little company towns, which are called oficinas. And when that industry went from boom to bust, those towns just kind of stayed exactly as they were, but all the people left. So all throughout the desert, you find these abandoned company towns, which have huge opera houses and basketball courts and the remains of pools and the houses people lived in. And because the desert is kind of like nature's preserver, they remain almost perfectly intact how they were when people left, like a kind of Chernobyl in the middle of the desert. It's quite wild. But it also speaks to the boom and bust cycle of a place like the Atacama, which is run on minerals. And just to jump forward to present day, I mean, lithium is the current mineral du jour, as we were talking about, because it's what we need to put in our electric cars. It's also what you find in your computers and your cell phones and all the sort of things that make our modern world function. But what I try to look at in this book is the effect that that is having on the places where those resources are coming from. So a lot of the lithium mines are found near indigenous settlements in the Atacama, often around the edge of salt flats. And so the thing that I think most people living, in perhaps North America or Europe or elsewhere don't realize is that to get lithium out of the earth, you need tons of water. And the Atacama is one of the parts of Earth that has the least amount of water to give. So what the lithium mining industry is doing is taking away a lot of the precious amounts of little amounts of water that these indigenous communities used to have to eke out a living there, to grow quinoa or other crops, and diverting that to these mines. So this is not to say that lithium is a bad thing, that this transition to greener energy is a bad thing, but um, the hope is that there will be a more sustainable way of extracting this mineral resource, which is currently in the midst of transforming the desert all over again.
You did this journey without your partner, which is not unique. You're a travel writer and you're often out exploring the world for, for a publication. And you wrote in the book, going solo means you microdose on the highs and loss, and or the highs of loss and renewal, which, I also travel for work and leave my family, and there is something special about that. But I'm just wondering, maybe if you can explain, what's it like, for you and your relationship, and how it, how it benefits, and maybe even how it makes it difficult.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the difficult and then go to the benefit. I mean, our relationship started, as I mentioned earlier, as a sort of a traveling relationship. We met in New Zealand. We traveled for 6 months in Asia. Then we moved to Australia for a year. We traveled for another 3 months in Asia. Then all of a sudden, by the time we got to Chile, my partner was able to find, a more career-driven 9 to 5 job, but I kept traveling. I kept up my work as a travel journalist, and so that transition was a little bit hard, I would say, just going from both of us always being on the move to only one of us. But I think we, over the years, have found the rhythm, and I think that we both quite enjoy, as I mentioned in the book, this microdosing on the highs of loss and renewal, because I think if you just have somebody around all the time, you can fester in the little things that make you angry, who didn't do the most chores today, those silly little things. But when you are together for a few weeks and then gone for a week or two and then back again, you sort of remember what you missed about the person, and you get to miss them and you get to find them again and rekindle after a moment of being apart. And I think that, at least for us, that's been one of the things that I think has allowed us to reach, 15 years now as a relationship, which in the gay world is like 100 years. So it's been pretty good for us.
I want to end and talk about the impact of living in a culture so long. And you write that you don't know if you're becoming more Chilean, but you're becoming less American. And, how does that manifest itself?
Yeah, so at this point, I've lived outside of the US for the vast majority of my adult life, and I think there's a lot of little things that I noticed that change over that time period, but one of the biggest things is sort of a losing of this overconfidence, that a lot of people, I think, from especially English-speaking, countries in the global North tend to have. When you come from the US or Canada or England or Australia, and you speak perfect English and you're out in the world, you tend to have this great confidence about you. And once you find yourself as a person who's forced to speak a second language, living in another country, you kind of crawl into your shell a little bit more, and you become a bit more introspective, and you speak a bit more intentionally instead of inevitably. Um, and I think that I've sort of witnessed that evolution of that version of myself that first went abroad and was first traveling, was just very the overconfident American out in the world, ready to conquer everything, to sort of a more not not that there's anything wrong with that, just that I think that now I'm more I tend to listen more than I speak. I tend to be more curious about the people that I'm meeting and not just about sharing my own opinions about what I'm seeing. Um, and there's also just little things too. I think your language starts to get a bit weird when you're living somewhere for so long and you're not around people from back home who keep up with the local slang, whatever it may be. Just the way you shop, the way you eat, the way you do certain things evolves over time. Just when you're not in your homeland anymore, you adopt to where you live. Yeah.
And so, you know, do you think there's things others can learn from your experience of leaving what was probably a really comfortable lifestyle in the US, and kind of just constant searching for things that are new and unique, constantly putting yourself in difficult situations?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think anyone should or necessarily needs to do that, but I would say that it has been, in my case, certainly very rewarding to let my life lead me where it has. I mean, when I look back on my life and I look back at split second decisions that I made all along the way that led me to, living in Chile for 10 years at this point, any of those decisions I could have made in a different way would have taken my life in a different direction. But I think what I learned, I guess, in my early 20s was that just to quote, this famous quote, "Not all those who wander are lost." Like, I felt like I was very intentionally wandering, in my early 20s to figure out what it was that I wanted out of my life, but because I was very intentionally doing that, it always took me to new and interesting places and opened me up to new opportunities and made my life a richer experience because of it. Yeah, I don't know if that's a lesson for others to learn necessarily, but it's certainly been fulfilling for me.
Could you imagine if you had, just taken a 9 to 5 and stayed, stayed in the same city you grew up? Like, do you think you're
No.
wired differently that just would
Yeah, I
never
don't think
have worked?
yeah, I don't think that would have ever necessarily happened. I've certainly worked 9 to 5 jobs over the year in the early years. I moved to New York right after college. I was working in the film industry. That was the first, break that set me off in a different direction. Um, yeah, maybe some people are wired differently. Maybe some people just open themselves up to saying yes to scary things and seeing where it takes them.
My sister has a whole theory she started 5 years ago of just saying yes,
Yeah.
and, she's put herself in place things she'd never do, and, like, she just has so many great things that have happened from saying
Yeah,
yes,
exactly. Yeah.
especially while she travels, instead of being kind of cautious, um, just finding these great things. Mark, this has been great to chat with you, and again, it was really great to read your book. I just wanna say thanks for taking time to come on the podcast and share all about it.
No, thank you, Richard. It's great to be here.
Um, if people want to find out more, follow along on your journeys, read more of your articles, you're a super active travel journalist as well. Like, it seems like you're in a big publication every kind of month or two. How can they find out more?
Yeah, sure. So you could go to my website, which is just my name, markjohansen.com, or you could follow me on social media, Mark on the Map. Or yeah, you could find the book at your local bookstore, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Yeah, anywhere you typically buy your books.
And the best thing you can do is go to your local independent bookstore and
Exactly.
ask
Yes.
them to order it. It'll take a week or two longer, but it will, keep these little bookstores around, as well as it's a nice signal for them to bring in more and hopefully feature it. And yeah,
Absolutely.
if you get it, I suspect you may have to set aside a weekend just to binge read it, which is always fun when you get that. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. I will put links to Mark's socials and an Amazon link to his book if you just want to buy it online in the show notes. And we'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Bye bye. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.